The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, meets this week in Laos. At the top of the agenda, the South China Sea. Territorial disputes between some member states and China are expected to come up at the summit. The talks take place just a week after an international tribunal issued an arbitration result in favor of the Philippines in a case it unilaterally brought against China. China neither accepts nor recognizes that result. Here to discuss the latest in China-ASEAN relations, CCTV's Wang Tongxuan joins us from Beijing. And Tongxuan, after the recent arbitration result from The Hague, how is China strengthening ties and moving forward with the ASEAN countries?
Well, Anand, experts from both sides believe China-ASEAN relations have a potential to go even deeper and will not be affected by the South China Sea issue. And to give you a bigger picture of China-ASEAN ties, let's take a look at their economic links. Bilateral trade has grown from less than $10 billion in 1991 to nearly $500 billion in 2015. Both sides have set a target of $1 trillion by 2020. It's no doubt that such a strong economic link has brought and will bring about tangible benefits to all the countries involved. And China takes this into consideration as it continues to strengthen its relations with ASEAN. Anand.
How can China and ASEAN countries cooperate to address the territorial dispute in the South China Sea?
Well, the maritime disputes in the South China Sea only involve certain ASEAN nations, so it is not an issue between China and ASEAN as a whole. But as China has reiterated, dialogue, negotiation and consultation remain the best way to solve the disputes. China and ASEAN has always had good communication channels, like the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, or DOC, signed in 2002, which serves as the basis for parties involved in disputes to explore peaceful ways towards resolution. The commitment to the DOC and to resolve disputes through friendly consultations and negotiations by countries directly concerned should be respected, and there is no absolutely a need for any third party to intervene. Also late in September, a summit marking the 25th anniversary of China-ASEAN relations will be held in Laos. Many believe it will serve as a platform for China and ASEAN countries to renew their relationship. So all in all, peace, security and stability serve the needs and interests of China and ASEAN countries. So a volatile situation in the South China Sea will do nobody any good, Anand.
And how does the One Belt, One Road project play into the China-ASEAN relationship?
Well, Anand, when it comes to Belt and Road Initiative, China sees ASEAN as a priority region. The project will promote trade and infrastructure construction in Southeast Asia. There are two main areas of interest, really. For one, interconnectivity. ASEAN countries need to further improve infrastructure construction and interconnectivity. That is why China proposed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Silk Road Fund project. Those institutions can provide long-term, low-cost financial services for them. Number two, production capacity and cooperation. China and ASEAN countries enjoying close economic and trade ties and complement each other in their manufacturing sectors. Both sides can jointly build industrial parks in ASEAN countries and attract Chinese investment. And this builds up regional supply, industrial and value chains, while elevating the status of China and ASEAN in global industrial distribution. Anand.
Okay, thank you. That's CCTV's Wang Tongxuan reporting from Beijing. Joining us now from Beijing, Victor Gao is a Chinese international relations expert and director of the China National Association of International Studies. From Singapore, Mingjiang is a professor of international studies at Nanyang Technological University. With me in the studio, Sourabh Gupta is a resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies, a Washington, D.C. think tank. And via Skype from Penang, Malaysia, Aisan O is the principal advisor of the Pacific Research Center in Malaysia. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Victor, there are several countries belonging to ASEAN which have territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea. Now we have this arbitration result announced by the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Will it have any effect, do you think, on China-ASEAN relations?
First of all, China-ASEAN relations are very important. ASEAN is increasingly important as a trade partner, but also ASEAN is playing increasingly important political role in addition to trade and economic role. China-ASEAN relations have to be further improved, and the free trade agreement between China and ASEAN need to be fully implemented for the benefit of China and ASEAN. It is true that between China and several ASEAN member states in their respective manner, there are territorial disputes. But it's not surprising. If we look at the world today, there are many, many pairs of territorial disputes in different parts of the world. Whenever you have a dispute involving territory, the best way forward is always for the two claimants to sit down, look at each other into the eye, engage in diplomacy and negotiation, and come up with a mutually acceptable solution. For any party to bring the case unilaterally without the consent of the other party, either to a court or arbitration tribunal, is not productive. And in this particular case involving China and the Filipino dispute, there were mechanisms and commitments both on the part of China and the Philippines for mutual discussion. There is this code of conduct between China and the ASEAN member states for resolving the disputes in the South China Sea and conducting themselves according to the best practice. So from the Chinese perspective, it is wrong for the Philippines to bring this case without China's consent to an arbitration, and China has declared that the arbitration award announced in The Hague on July the 12th as a piece of scrap paper. And China is not the first country, and China will not be the last country in the world to completely disregard illegal or illegitimate ruling like this. The United States did that several years ago. Other countries have done so on many occasions. Even a small country like Iceland stood up and refused to implement an award from a similar body like the Tribunal for Arbitration. So I would say the rest of the world should not be surprised if China will stand firm on principle to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity in the South China Sea and completely disregard this ruling.
Mingjiang, let's look at Singapore. It has no claims in the South China Sea, and it's also enjoyed a very close bilateral relationship with China. Given that, is Singapore in a good place to promote the relationship between ASEAN and China?
Well, to answer your first question, I think the arbitration has created a small negative factor in ASEAN-China relations. This is so because ASEAN, in a way, is trying to work on integration, and this includes the political and security community. And some ASEAN member countries who are claimant states in the South China will try to use ASEAN as a platform to put pressure on China. And China, in response, will put pressure on some ASEAN countries that are close to China and try not to allow ASEAN as a grouping to play any bigger role in the South China Sea security management. And you will see also external powers working on ASEAN and some ASEAN countries. So ASEAN will constantly face these pressures from all parties. And in a way, it will be a negative factor in ASEAN-China relations because it creates a lot of uncertainties. And from time to time, whenever ASEAN says something, and China will be unhappy, but when ASEAN doesn't say anything, other parties will be unhappy. So it actually creates some complication in ASEAN-China relations. And Singapore, like many other countries in the region, the non-claimant states in Southeast Asia do not take a side on the sovereignty issue. Rather, small non-claimant states in the region and try to work with China and other powers in the security management arena in the South China disputes. And they have tried to work with China to create norms and rules to manage in the South China Sea, but of course it's very difficult.
Aisan, we have Malaysia, which has claims in the South China Sea, and some of these claims overlap Chinese claims in the same region. But despite that, these two countries have enjoyed very good relations. They've cultivated a very close relationship, and there's been increased economic cooperation between the two countries. What is Malaysia's approach to resolving territorial disputes with China?
Well, Malaysia traditionally adopts a more comprehensive approach. Some other commentators would call it a more nuanced approach, but I would call it comprehensive because the overall relations between Malaysia and China remains quite good. For example, China is Malaysia's largest trading partner, and Malaysia is also China's largest trading partner in Southeast Asia. So we typically would look at, for example, the economic relations between the two countries first. And for a very long time, the disputes over territories in South China Sea, for example, between Malaysia and China, it has always been put on a sort of a back burner. However, in recent years, for various reasons, this sort of disputes, this sort of tensions has risen, and Malaysia tried to act with restraint. For example, when there were encounters in disputed territories, we will often play it down unless sometimes when it gets more frequent and so on, then perhaps you will voice certain statements, but very soon we will then proceed with China in some other forms of economic cooperations. We try to look at the broader picture, and we try to, for example, adhere to, I think broadly what the late Chinese leader, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, has propounded about 30 years ago, namely to set aside the disputes for the moment and looking forward to a joint development of the disputed areas. That, I think, is also a principle which Malaysia holds quite dear to.
Sourabh, clearly there are tensions in the region. To what extent has the United States pivot to Asia, as it's sometimes called, or rebalancing strategy contributed to raising those tensions?
The rebalance strategy has added to those tensions. It has compounded those tensions because the U.S. very publicly wanted to show that it was part of the region. It had always been part of the region and had not gone anywhere. But because of the distractions in Iraq and in the Middle East, it wanted to show that we are back in the region. And that gave a sense that the United States would be engaged. But the problem has been that the disproportionate focus of the pivot has been on the security and on the military side. It has not been an all-encompassing engagement with ASEAN, as many in the US themselves would have liked to, frankly. So it has mostly been through the security military lens.
So the pivot is also about economic interests.
It is about economic. It is about engaging Asia, the Asia Pacific and the ASEAN countries in a comprehensive manner, so that the US is seen as being a political guarantor also to the stability of the Asia Pacific region, not just a security guarantor. But the pivot was fleshed out for reasons to refocus on Asia, but it was not fleshed out in any particular detail as such what those security elements would be. And so those elements can be dramatized and are not well communicated. And so that gives an impression that this is mostly just a security focus, which is at the end of the day aimed at either containing China or managing China. The US needs to have gotten its communications much better, and of course, a disproportionate amount of the focus of that pivot has happened in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, which has been a flashpoint, and so that has just compounded tensions. So the US needs to communicate better and also not get too engaged in areas where it does not have more than just its basic interests involved. And in the South China Sea, beyond navigation, I don't see what the real particular interests are with regard to in that area. And the US needs to get this right.
Right. Victor, what is your view on that? Has the US policy, this pivot to Asia, has it raised tensions?
Well, first of all, over the past several years, the United States has been talking a lot about pivoting back to Asia. Let's pause a moment and ask ourselves, when did the United States pivot out of Asia? It was in the 1970s when the United States was defeated in Vietnam. And it was in the 1980s when the United States was driven out of Clark Air Base as well as the Subic Naval Base in the Philippines. And in between, for example, ever since the United States pivoted out of Asia until they decided to pivot back to Asia, what happened? Southeast Asia, East Asia have remained very, very peaceful and stable. There's been no incidents at all by any count of interruption of the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea or East China Sea. Whereas at the same time, the United States really did havoc in other parts of the world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, Libya, Syria, etc. We could even argue that the exodus of refugees and economic migrants to Europe was very much partially caused by the United States and what they did in that part of the world. Therefore, when the United States want to pick back to Asia, let's be very careful about the potential consequences of what the Americans may cause in this part of the world. People in this part of the world should not lose sanity by indulging in the fantasy that if the United States wants to pivot back, I can band myself up on that bandwagon of the United States and take the liberty of challenging China. No, fundamentally, I think China and the United States should remain calm with each other and engage with each other as partners. We may not like everything each other will do, but we need to at least maintain composure and refuse to fall out of control and see the escalation of tension between China and the United States. Other smaller and medium-sized countries should not cheer about any escalation of tension between Beijing and Washington and should use their sanity and wisdom to urge both China and the United States to calmly and peacefully engage with each other, to talk about the differences. If anyone wants to really indulge in the fantasy that the higher the tension between China and the United States, the better it will be for my own personal interest or country interest, that is really fantasy. Therefore, the United States need to really get a firm handle as to what exactly it wants to achieve.